Good evening to our in-person audience, as well as those of you who are joining us from your homes on Zoom. Wanted to welcome you to our annual Catholic-Orthodox Lecture, which is part of our Catholic-Orthodox initiative, an initiative that was made possible by a generous donation from Solon and Mariana Patterson, who are with us this evening. Thank you very much. We're really excited about our lecture and our presenter tonight. George is somebody that I've been going to conferences with, but actually I've seen him from a distance and we've emailed numerous times, but we'd never actually met in person. So this is a lovely moment for us to be able to connect. George Demacopoulos is the Father John Meindorf and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies at Fordham University. He is the co-founding director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center and the co-founding editor of the Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies. He's a native of Tennessee, so not far from here, and he came to Fordham in 2002 after receiving his PhD in religious studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As I mentioned, Dr. Demacopoulos co-founded Fordham's Orthodox Christian Studies Center, which is the only research university center of Orthodox Christianity in the United States. The center facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarly work related to Orthodox Christianity broadly understood. He specializes in the history of Christianity for late antiquity, the early medieval West, and Byzantium. He also works broadly in the field of Orthodox Christian Studies and serves as the co-founding editor of the Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies. Over the past few years, his research has been focused in three general areas. One, Christian East and Christian West in the Middle Ages. Two, the application of critical theory, especially post-colonial theory, to the study of Orthodox Christianity. And three, early Byzantine hymnography. He's also been very much involved in Christian Orthodox relations, and he's going to tell you a bit of a story about that, I know, to begin his presentation. And his title, as you are aware, the title of his talk is Catholic-Orthodox Dialogue in the nearly 20 years since Pope John Paul II. A church historian's perspective. George is not only a church historian, but he's somebody who's on the ground doing this kind of dialogue work, and I'm really pleased to have him here tonight. Welcome, George Demacopoulos.
Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it. Okay, so everybody can hear me? I'm fully so welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back in Atlanta again. Thank you to the invitation, Greg. I'm glad we finally got to meet each other after tweeting back and forth to one another for a dozen years. I don't know that we even do that anymore, but been emailing and following one another for a long time, and always great to be with the Pattersons, of course, and other friends. So thank you for coming. So I am at Fordham. My academic work has always focused on the relationship between Eastern and Western Christians in the Middle Ages. As I would explain to my mother, how we went from one church to two, right? And so every academic project I've ever taken on has some aspect of that wrapped up in it. As a very young scholar, just a couple years out of grad school, I was invited by somebody at the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople to assist with a formal request that the relics of St. John Chrysostom and St. Gregory the Theologian, also known as St. Gregory Nazianzen, could be returned from the Vatican to Constantinople. And lo and behold, those of you who know the Pope John Paul's biography extremely well, I don't necessarily expect anyone to know that really well, but if you know his biography really well, you'll know that the last public event that he did was in November of 2004, where he sat side by side with the Ecumenical Patriarch in an ecumenical Vesper service in St. Peter's Basilica, with the relics of St. Gregory and St. Chrysostom in front of him, and officially returned the relics to the Orthodox Church and to the Ecumenical Patriarch specifically, because both of these saints had themselves been archbishops of Constantinople. At the time, those of us who were church historians were saying that this was probably one of the most significant ecumenical breakthroughs for Orthodox and Catholics, probably since the rescinding of the schisms, or the rescinding of the excommunications in the 1960s. And so it was a really momentous event. Greg and I were talking about what I'd talk about tonight. It occurred to me that there was a lot of optimism there. I was invited, the Pattersons were there. I was invited to go to Constantinople when the relics were brought back from Italy to Constantinople and interred in the church there. And it was a really, really moving series of days. And for those of us who really cared about the cause of Christian unity, there was a great deal of optimism. And the world has changed dramatically, I would say, in those 20 years. And so what I'm going to do, what I'm going to do for you this evening is I'm going to identify a few ways that I think the cause of kind of authentic theological, liturgical communion is challenged and has actually become more challenged in the last 20 years. I'm going to talk about kind of new ecumenical directions that I don't think anybody ever would have anticipated. And then I'm going to, my wife always says when I lecture, she asks me the question when she's deciding if she's going to come or not. She says, well, is it going to be one of your normal talks or is it going to be hopeful? And so I promised her as I was leaving New York, I promised this would be a hopeful one too. And so I will give a few examples of why 20 years after the return of the relics, I am still hopeful for the cause of Christian unity. Okay, so how is the world for the Orthodox and Catholic churches changed in 20 years? It's changed in a lot of ways. I'm going to focus briefly on two. The first is something that we all know, we're all aware of, but I'm going to name it anyway, which is the dropout rate of active participation of Western Christians is absolutely falling off a cliff, right? It is happening to all mainline Christian traditions. Maybe we tell ourselves it's not quite as bad for the Orthodox and Catholics as it is for others, but it's pretty bad. The one statistic I do know, there was a credible survey done of 40-year-old Greek Americans about 5 years ago that was, that simply asked all of them had grown up in the church, whatever that means. They had at one point in their life, they had identified as being Greek Orthodox Christians in the United States. And 50% of them no longer identified as Christians. Right? So they've like a retention rate of half from youth to 40 years old. I mean, that is just fundamentally unsustainable. Right? Those of us who kind of do religion for a living, there are all kinds of theories trying to explain this, you know, whatever they are, right? I mean, young people are opting out of all institutions. It's not just organized religion. It's the politicization of things that happen in the church, on and on and on. We are familiar with this. And this talk is not about solving that problem. Right, but it's simply naming that problem as something that was unforeseen 20 years ago. I mean, it was a problem then. It wasn't a problem of this magnitude then, right? The other thing is that, now I'm a medieval historian, I'm not a modern historian, but from a medieval historian's perspective, the modern Orthodox Church and the modern Catholic Church are themselves fragmenting in ways I would not have predicted 20 years ago. And in some curious ways as well. So on the Orthodox side, you have the fragmentation of a kind of rivalry between the Church of Moscow and the Church of Constantinople, which has been greatly exacerbated by the Ukrainian war. The Moscow Church refuses to even commune with the Church of Constantinople. Technically, it's not a schism because Constantinople will commune Moscow. It has to go both ways for it to be a schism. So you have this kind of very serious fragmentation in the Orthodox world, and it doesn't help that the Moscow Patriarchate buys off all of the other churches. Like, I'm not making that up. They literally buy off all the other churches. The Serbian church, the Antiochian church, the Cypriot church, Mount Athos, on and on and on, right? In the Catholic world, of course, you have, I mean, it's not a schism, but you have a fragmentation between the Benedictine, or the Pope Benedict model papacy and the Pope Francis model papacy, with all of its various contours for a truly global church, right? It plays out one way in the United States, which I think is very differently from the way it plays out in Africa or Latin America or Europe. But nonetheless, it's there and it's very, very real. And then in the United States, you have this kind of bizarro world. Like I've never kind of seen it. You have this bizarro world fragmentation within the church, but one that is directly related to broader American political cultures, right? And so this is occurring in both the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, right? The new Greek Archbishop, who I have the great joy to know, and I'm in New York, so I get to spend some time with him. He's really a wonderful, wonderful man. He had been in New York for all of about a few months when COVID started and the Black Lives Matter movement started, and somebody invited him to go to a Black Lives Matter march. Actually, the current mayor of New York City was then the president of Brooklyn, and he invited him to come. And the current archbishop, sorry, this is a tangent, but you're going to see where this, I think, is relevant to explaining the current moment. So the current archbishop is from Turkey. He has a lifetime of understanding systemic prejudice. He had authentically no idea what Black Lives Matter was. Never heard of it, never seen it, had no understanding of what it was. And so the president of Brooklyn invited him to come to a Black Lives Matter march. And he said, absolutely, right? And he held up the sign, right? And here you have the Greek archbishop holding up the sign, Black Lives Matter. And you can imagine the vitriol on the one side and the sanctification on the other side, right? All going kind of on in the Orthodox world in a kind of way in which you got this impression that you had two fundamentally different churches with fundamentally different theological visions, right? But they all came to church together, supposedly on Sunday, and had the liturgy together, right? And so you have that, like, I can't think of a parallel in the medieval church where, I mean, you had stupid schisms in the medieval church, don't get me wrong, and all the time. But I can't think of one that was so fundamentally tied to a kind of different cultural, political orientation that superseded any kind of theological consciousness, right? And so these are kind of the challenges as I see them. On the one hand, you have this kind of wide-scale opting out challenge. And people are wondering what the church of 30 years from now is going to look like. And on the other hand, you have these forces that are pushing the churches to fragment among themselves. And so then if the goal is Christian unity, and we all know the goal is Christian unity because it's scriptural, right? Then how is that actually going to happen, right? Because it seems like all the forces are against it. Okay. So a couple of other things that I observe. And it's largely driven from this final observation concerning the fragmentation over political causes. Is one of the really unexpected outcomes of the fragmentation over political and cultural outlook is that fragmentation within the Catholic Church or within the Orthodox Church is actually leading to a new kind of ecumenism between like-minded political or cultural activists, right? So your Trumpian Catholics find real common cause with your Trumpian Orthodox, right? And your AOC Catholics find real common cause with your AOC Orthodox. And believe it or not, there are actually AOC Orthodox. You wouldn't think there are, but there actually are, right? Especially in Greece, right? And you find these you find these kind of grassroots coalition. I mean, they're not ecumenical. They're not looking for they're not looking for liturgical unity, but they are clustering sociologically in ways that I don't think anybody would have anticipated. And it's not just the kind of parishioners. You have priests and clergy and bishops doing it too, right? Before the Ukraine war broke out, and so at the highest level, right? Before the Ukraine war broke out, in the years since Pope Francis has been elected, he and the Ecumenical Patriarchate had been in the same room about 10 times. All right, so from the time of Francis's election to the Ukraine war starting, the Ecumenical Patriarch and the Patriarch of Moscow had been in the same room once. Right? In other words, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew found more reasons to want to be with, right, and found more common cause for common initiatives, Christian unity first and foremost among them, but also issues about the environment, issues about sustainability, issues about refugees. I mean, they did a series of things about the refugees in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? There was far more reason for them to get together than there was for him and the Moscow Patriarch, right? Another example of this kind of unexpected ecumenism, and here I'll stretch it wider than just the Orthodox Catholic, and this is actually coming from Moscow, and this is the heavy investment that the Putin government has spent in the propping up of a kind of global network of traditional values, right? And I mean millions and millions and millions of dollars. And the Putin government and Patriarch Kirill and a number of very famous American evangelicals, right? It's subsided since the Ukrainian war, but for about the 8 years prior to that, had built a series of global networks to promote this idea of traditional family values that kind of undercut political regimes, it undercut institutional churches, and it was all designed to prop up an atheist, Vladimir Putin, as the kind of global defender of the traditional Christian family, whatever that was supposed to be, right? And they similarly found common cause with the Saudis, with the Iranians, and so forth, right? I mean, the only thing all these people have in common is they hate gay people, right? Or they pretend to. And so they found this way to sort of build these kind of coalitions. And it's, you know, as I was saying to the good deacon, it's a kind of bizarro world ecumenism, right? Where you have people like Kirill and Jerry Falwell, who just fundamentally believe the other one is a sinner and going to hell and has no theological vision whatsoever. And yet they are actively working together to promote a kind of global political order, right? So it's not any kind of authentic Christian unity-focused ecumenism, but it is a deliberate sort of bridging of ecclesial divides for non-theological reasons. And I would make the case that all of that is yet a further obstacle to authentic ecumenical work and ecumenical dialogue. Okay, so that's all the bleak stuff. Now I'm going to talk about the good stuff, right? Why is it that 20 years after the fact, I still remain hopeful, in some ways even more hopeful? So let me start with the world I know the best, which is the academic world. 20 years ago, I will probably be wrong. 20 years ago, there was no Center of Orthodox Christian Studies in the world that was kind of freestanding and not part of a seminary in Russia or something like that. It fundamentally did not exist, right? Not at a university. Not at a university. 20 years ago, you did not have and what's noteworthy about the Fordham venture, obviously, is that it is an Orthodox center in a Catholic Jesuit institution. When I was hired at Fordham, as far as we can tell, it was the first time in American academic history that you had two graduates of an Orthodox seminary on the same theological faculty. It had never happened before. And now, by my count, there are at least 5 schools in the United States that have the exact same thing. All right? So in addition to the Fordham Center, there's the Huffington, like newly created things. There's the Huffington Ecumenical Center at Loyola. There is a new Huffington Ecumenical Center at the Orthodox Seminary at Holy Cross. I think that it predated it, but there is there's a Roman Catholic Ecumenical Center called the Graymore Institute in New York that's run by the Franciscans, and it is newly invigorated and very active. You have a spectacular new executive director here at the Aquinas Center, which is going to be very interested and invested in ecumenical efforts. In other words, 20 years ago, there was nothing at the kind of, I mean, you absolutely had people in institutions doing academic work, but you didn't have the investment of patrons like the Pattersons and others, right? And you didn't have the commitment of institutions like Fordham and Emory and Loyola and Notre Dame and Duquesne and Marquette and Catholic University of America, right? Mostly Catholic schools, by the way, right? Really kind of investing in this kind of thing. And And they're all doing it differently. I mean, and that's good that they're all doing it differently. Like the Fordham model is really research funding, publication. We do events, but we don't do a lot of events, right? The events are really to let people know what we're doing, but the real investment is in the kind of high-end conferences, the research fellowships, the production of books, a double-blind peer-reviewed journal, right? That sort of thing. Others are doing constant streams of events, ecumenical events. I mean, here you're going to be getting into the active work in parishes, right? I mean, that's fabulous. None of this was happening 20 years ago, right? None of it. So that's one reason to be really, really hopeful. And I'll give one anecdote I told the Pattersons years ago, and they seem to like it, I think. I'm not sure they're even going to remember it. In the Orthodox Church in the 20th century, the vast majority of the population only took communion 2 times a year. They took communion on their feast day. So if you were St. Michael, the feast of St. Michael, and you took communion on Christmas, maybe 3 times a year, Christmas and Easter. That was it. You didn't do it anymore. There are a whole bunch of reasons going back to the Ottoman period of why you didn't do it. Nobody took communion. Father John Meyendorff and Father Alexander Schmemann were teaching at St. Vladimir's in the 1960s and 70s. And they knew that that was not the historical record of the church, right? That the historical practice of the church was frequent communion to the point of 2 or 3 times a week. And Meyendorff and Schmemann published, and they published a lot, and they published on these issues. And Orthodox seminaries, Serbian seminaries, Greek seminaries, OCA seminaries, were all assigning Meyendorff and Schmemann. So 40 years ago, nobody was taking communion. And now if you go to a GOA parish, the communion line takes so long, it's an extra 30 minutes at church, right? In other words, what my colleague would call sort of trickle-down theology, right? The publication does actually change things if it's done right, right? And so one of the reasons I'm so optimistic about the future of the ecumenical cause is precisely because there are a number of institutions with funding that are not only doing the research end, but doing the kind of mass appeal end. And people are learning that this is kind of the authentic vision of the church. Okay, that's reason number one. A second reason that I'm so excited, and here I'm speaking just purely anecdotally about what I see at Fordham. So in the Orthodox Church, you have this college network called Orthodox Christian Fellowship. So if you have a priest with some spare time on their hands, and there are no priests with spare time on your hands, but if you have a priest with spare time on their hands and an interest, the priest will sort of attach himself to a university, and the priest will then try to organize the Orthodox kids on campus. They'll do a service, maybe a service project, a couple times a month, right? And it's an active student club. It is as active as the students want it to be, okay? So my colleague and I at Fordham, we've been the faculty sponsors for the Orthodox Christian Fellowship at Fordham for 20 years. And its success rises and falls based on student interest. That's to be expected. We can't make it happen. They have to want to do it themselves. It's a club. It's not a class. But here's what I've noticed in just the last 4 or 5 years. We have always varied between 7 and 25 people. Like it goes like this over the years. Half the people that attend OCF at Fordham are Roman Catholics. Right? And I find that utterly fascinating. They're not looking to convert, right? They're not looking to convert. They are looking to have their faith enhanced by being exposed to something else, right? A similar thing that I see at Fordham. Fordham, we have the only Orthodox Christian Studies minor in the United States, right? At a university, right? Forget the seminaries. Again, it varies with the number of people we have, between 10, 20 people a year. There's no obvious job at the other end of a minor in Orthodox Christian Studies. Half the students in the minor program are Roman Catholics, right? Maybe 5% of the students are Protestants. So basically, a little less than half of the students doing the minor in Orthodox studies are themselves Orthodox Christians. I find that fascinating, right? Even though people are coming to Fordham because of the center, right? So you have students that come to Fordham because of the center. They don't necessarily end up minoring in Orthodox studies, but they're talking with people anyway. And then just this year, we started this new fellows program. I haven't even, we have a couple of our board members here. I haven't even mentioned this to everybody yet. We have this new fellows program. And again, this is possible because we have funding, right? And so, I mean, we do all of these events and people aren't coming. We're like, we should get more people to come to our events. And so we started this fellows program. So if you are an undergraduate, we don't need you to sign up. You don't need to take a minor. You don't need to do anything. Just send in an application, which is about a sentence long. Attend 3 events a semester. Write a 1-page summary of the public events you saw that were sponsored by the center. And we'll give you a $250 stipend to buy pizza for the next semester. Right? I mean, you can spend it on anything you want, but we'll give you $250, right? We're trying it this semester. We have 57 people sign up for it. I think 20 of them are Orthodox, right? And so my optimism here is simply, there are young people that are interested in religion, and there are young people that are interested in learning about other faith traditions, but they don't think about religion in the same way they did when I was their age. When I was growing up in the 80s, right, you thought in terms of denominational confession. I'm Orthodox. Now let me define that by juxtaposing it to Catholicism as I'm talking to all the Baptists that live on my block because I grew up in Tennessee, right? Even the doctoral students that come to Fordham, they're all kind of, and they're, well, not all of them, but most of them are practicing Christians, but not a one of them self-identifies according to denomination. Right? I mean, they might have been raised in a Baptist or Methodist or Catholic church, but very few of them self-identify as such. They are simply interested in theology, right? And I mean, having doctoral students is a different thing than undergraduates, but even undergraduates, I think, see it the same ways. These boundaries that we were once so fixated on, right? And the kind of confessionalism of belief that we've been so fixated on since the Reformation, I see that easing away. And some might say, well, that's just the influence of secularism and it aligns with people opting out of the church. And yes, but why do I have all of these kids that aren't Orthodox coming to all of this Orthodox programming at Fordham? Right? I see this kind of anecdotal optimism. The third reason I'm optimistic is that there are actually a few good bishops out there. Not a lot. I'm being recorded, right? But there are a few, right? And some of them are really, really good. I mean, I had the great blessing to meet Wilton Gregory when I was here and gave a lecture a few years ago. I mean, he was phenomenal, right? Absolutely phenomenal. And with respect to Christian unity, the new Archbishop of the Greek Church in the United States is just extraordinary. Now, again, he comes from Turkey. The situation in Turkey is really, really, really different. It is utterly unlike the situation in Greece. So for Americans, that might not make any sense, right? But the situation for a Greek Christian from Turkey is fundamentally different than a Greek Christian from Greece. Because in Greece, it's the normative position in a Western society. I mean, slightly impoverished, but Western nonetheless. In Turkey, you are talking about an absolutely actively persecuted, tiny minority, right? There are 80 million people in Turkey. They are down to about 2,000 Greek Christians, right? And that's the context that Archbishop Elpidophoros comes from. And he sees the cause of Christian unity in just a fundamentally different way than we see it, right? In the Middle East, in most of the nations of the Middle East, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, right? Iraq, if there are any Christians left in Iraq, I don't know. There are very, very few. In all of these nations, the confessional boundaries that used to separate liturgical unity have simply evaporated. I mean, they're not officially in communion with one another, but they are all intermarrying, they are all interbaptizing, and they are all intercommuning, right? If you, as Mariana was saying before, if you are in the hinterland of Turkey, you're so happy that a Christian priest has shown up. It doesn't matter if you're Catholic, Armenian, Chalcedonian, or not. You're just happy that you have the chance to receive the Eucharist, right? And this is the experience that the Archbishop knows, right? And he's bringing, in part, he's bringing that legacy to him. In part, he's a real theologian. I mean, he had an academic appointment at the University of Thessalonica, which is the best school in Greece, theological school in Greece. He gave a lecture at Fordham 5 or 6 years ago. No, he hasn't been here 5 or 6 years. He gave COVID, I've lost track of time. He gave a lecture at Fordham 3 years ago where, and I love this, in the Orthodox Church at least, we're very accustomed to using the phrase mixed marriage when we talk about an Orthodox marrying a Catholic or an Orthodox marrying a Lutheran or something like that. And he fundamentally objected to the term. There are no mixed marriages, he says. There are ecumenical marriages. And that is just such a, to my mind, such a brilliant way of recalibrating what many people, at least in the Orthodox world, see to be an extraordinary challenge, and him turning it into the possibility of being an extraordinary opportunity, right? And it's just that really different mindset that gives me a lot of hope. And he has backed it up further than that still. Now, the Orthodox Church, it doesn't work quite like the Roman Church. So just because he makes a pastoral recommendation, it doesn't impact the entire country. It only impacts the parishes directly under him, which are about 50 or 60 parishes. But he has given every priest in the direct diocesan district the pastoral authority to commune partners in ecumenical marriages. I don't know of any other Orthodox bishop outside of the Middle East or war-torn Ukraine ever doing the same thing in the modern church, right? He's not mandating it, right? He's not telling them they have to do it. He is leaving it to the pastoral discretion of the priest who knows the couple, right? Is this appropriate for this family, for their children, and so forth? If so, he has their blessing. They have his blessing to do so. And my suspicion is that at least in places like the United States or Canada or so forth, at least in the Greek Orthodox Church, this will happen more and more. Now, the Orthodox world is sufficiently dysfunctional that if the Greeks start doing it, then the others might object all the more so that they can kind of position themselves as being different, right? That's kind of what the Moscow Patriarch does. But at least for the foreseeable future, for as long as I'm teaching at Fordham, I think that this will become more and more prevalent in the Greek Orthodox Church in America. And to be honest, that is a lived reality for families that when I met Solon and Mariana 20 years ago in Constantinople, I did not think was realistic within 20 years, right? It is. It is, and it's happening. I'm not saying it's happening all the time or it's widespread, and I'm not saying he's not being criticized for it. But it is fully within his authority to authorize this within his own jurisdiction. So I think I'll end it there with, that's kind of my final reason for optimism, and I'd be happy to talk about any of this. Yeah.
So we have some time for questions. Yes, sir. I'm gonna give you a microphone just for our Zoom.
When you say commune, you mean give communion to the? Is that what you're?
Yeah, I'm saying he is authorizing priests to give the Eucharist to practicing Roman Catholics.
I thought that's what you meant. I just wanted to.
Yeah. Now, typically, what's going on in these situations? So, I mean, well, one statistic that is worth mentioning that in the last 10 years in the GOA. More than 80% of the marriages that have been performed in GOA parishes, more than 80% have been these ecumenical marriages, mixed marriages, right? So to the extent that anybody's getting married, which nobody's getting married, but to the extent that anybody's getting married, right, in the GOA, they are all these kinds of marriages. And I suspect that what he has in mind, but he hasn't laid it out, right? I suspect that what he has in mind is when you do have those families, and there are a lot of them. I see them in my own parish on Long Island, where the Roman Catholic spouse isn't actively going to a Roman Catholic parish. They're in church with the family. They're in the Orthodox Church with the family every week, but they don't want to convert. Right? They don't want to turn the back on the tradition in which they were raised. He is encouraging the priests to commune them so that the family communes together. I don't know that he has in mind the person who ordinarily is at a Catholic parish but happens to be here one time a year. I don't suspect that that's the kind of person he has in mind. I think it's the other. But yeah, offering the Eucharist.
This in writing?
Has he put it in writing? He referred to it obliquely in the talk that he gave at Fordham, which is in writing. We published it in the journal. So we do this annual, it's the Ecumenical Orthodox in America Lecture. So it's our signature public event that we do every year, and he delivered it a few years ago. And they are published in the journal. He did refer to it there in passing. He did not lay out any of the specifics in writing. I think he rather wisely realizes that if he gives a kind of vague verbal encouragement, it actually makes it easier than if he issues any kind of official statement then that is then going to be critiqued. It actually makes it easier for the priests because he's the only one who's in a position to censor the priests. and he's telling them, you have my blessing, go ahead and do it. Whereas if he put something in, well, I mean, he could do it, and maybe we'd like to see him do it. But if he put something in writing, somebody somewhere would try to cause trouble for him. And it's probably just easier to do it this way, at least for now. He did, I will say quickly, he did mention the same thing at a Leadership 100 conference. At a Leadership 100 conference, he said this verbally.
If I understood you correctly, at Fordham you said there were Catholic students that were joining the group,
Yes.
the Orthodox group, and I think you said they weren't interested in changing, but they were interested in expand. Could you maybe elaborate on that, or what they're looking for?
Sure. Yeah. So we're a pretty big and active center, so we've got a lot of different things going on. So on the kind of Christian fellowship side, so the student club that is really religiously focused, right? You have often now half the participants that show up to anything, even a worship service, but especially the social events or the kind of let's go clean up the neighborhood events and those kinds of things. Always 50% of the people who show up are Roman Catholic. And I think what they are, they're not, I mean, they're interested in learning more about the Orthodox Church, but they're not what you would call actual inquirers. They're not really thinking of converting. I mean, Fordham is a pretty progressive place, and the presentation of Roman Catholicism at Fordham is pretty progressive. It's not kind of in-your-face confessional, right? And so, in other words, the way Catholicism is often presented by campus ministry at Fordham is that you can learn more about Catholicism by exploring other faith traditions, because they have this kind of holistic, ecumenical, Catholic vision of what Roman Catholicism is. And so, even on the Catholic side at Fordham, they're being encouraged to learn more, right? And they're coming to Orthodoxy on the club side because they find its liturgy beautiful. They find that it's offering things that they don't necessarily have. And they, especially those that come from ethnic families, whether they're Irish, Italian, Polish, whatever, they find a lot of kind of common cultural identity with the Greeks, the Romanians, the Serbs, and so forth. So that's the kind of religious side. On the academic side, like the people that are doing the minor and doing the fellowship and things like that, Fordham has a very active international business school, right? And we've sort of successfully made the case to people who may not necessarily be interested in religion per se, that if you want to like work for the State Department, or you want to be in international business, every geopolitical hotspot in the world, the native Christian experience is Orthodox Christian. So whether you're talking about, right, so the Christians, whether you're talking about Gaza, or whether you're talking about Ukraine, or whether you're talking about Iraq, or whether you're talking about, you know, the Balkans, whatever, most of the geopolitical hotspots, Ethiopia, right, Armenia, Azerbaijan, right, all of these places, the local Christian community is part of the Orthodox world broadly understood. So if you want to be in international affairs, if you want to be involved in international business, State Department, whatever, the best thing you can do is learn about that space, and the best way you can learn about that space is take courses in Orthodox Christian studies, right? And so, So the Orthodox Christian Studies minor is not, at Fordham at least, it's not just appealing to faithful Orthodox kids. There are a whole range of students who see that it is in their interest to kind of understand this world better.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from someone in the webinar.
This attendee writes, I am an Orthodox layperson who believes that Orthodox cooperation and ultimately reunification with Catholics is essential if humanity is to survive its unprecedented challenges, such as climate change. Beyond praying for unity and deepening our experience and knowledge of our own faith, what can we do to work towards Orthodox Catholic unity? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the question, right? Yeah, I mean, I'm convinced, and Solon and Mary, I've had the benefit of knowing them for 20 years now, so we've had many, many conversations along these lines. Even the bishops will say that this needs to be a grassroots movement, because the bishops will not, they are pulled in too many other directions, they are too concerned with other things, they are not going to mandate to the people what should be done. The vast majority of them will not. Too many of them are self-serving. I said it on video, right? That's why tenure's great. It has to be grassroots, right? And I think the ecumenical marriages or the mixed marriages is really the single greatest way that we have the potential to sort of let this cause be known, right? When you have families like Solon and Mariana who have been a model of marriage, right, for decades and decades and decades, but have not been able to commune together, right? And you have so many other families that are presented with the same challenge, right? Young families, older families presented with the same challenge. Far, far too many of them are just giving up, right? I mean, there's a variety of spectrums. Some do it the way that Solon and Mariana did, which was to be active in both traditions. Sometimes you just kind of pick one. Increasingly, you just opt out, right? And I think that the kind of active parish work that you're doing here, right, and that you've sponsored here, right, where you bring a local Greek parish, or a real local, doesn't have to be Greek, a local Orthodox parish and a local Catholic parish together, and let them do kind of social events to bring them together and learn from one another and find out that they all already know each other or know one another's associates or brothers or whatever anyway, right? That kind of grassroots efforts, I think, can pay huge dividends. And if you do enough of that and it builds and it grows, then the institutional church is going to kind of follow after the people. I wish I had a simpler short-term solution. I don't. I mean, for our part, Greg and I are going to keep doing the academic work, right? But I think, and the academic work supports it because we show that that's kind of the authentic history of the church. But to really move the needle, it's going to have to come from the people.
George, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I have two completely unrelated questions.
Okay.
I may ask one at a time. About 35 years ago, when I was a student, I studied with one of the preeminent Lutheran ecumenists, Wolfhard Pannenberg, in Germany. And he made the case then that he thinks if there's progress on a lot of ecclesiological questions in the world, it will come from the Orthodox in the US.
Oh.
And I think you may disagree or agree with him. One of the things he talked about was, I think, the question of women's ordination. And I think the point he was trying to make is because of the social location of the Orthodox who live in the U.S., a fairly liberal society by and large, well, now we're in a different world than we used to, but the pressure of society on young Orthodox Christians here is of a different sort than in traditionally Orthodox countries. And so he was imagining that if you see this even within evangelicalism on a lot of ethical questions, that the young people are influenced by society as a whole, and they have a very different take on ethical issues than the parents' generation. So, but my question to you is, do you think there is something that the Orthodox Church in the U.S. context can bring to the world Orthodox Church and in extension to ecumenism between Orthodox and Catholic?
So I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but obviously I've known of him and his work for as long as I've been doing this. He's a prophet. and let me give you a few, so he may not have precisely this way, but let me give you a few reasons why I think he's probably right. So all the reasons you mentioned, but in addition to those, so all right, Telly and I, my colleague Aristotle Papanikolaou, he goes by Telly. Telly and I were the first, right? And we were the first two together, and we had extraordinary institutional support, and we've had extraordinary donor support to do what we do. But even beyond that, what differentiates the kind of American situation from what you would have in the traditional Orthodox countries is Telly and I and another 40 people that are at other institutions, right? That have PhDs in theology or religious studies or church history or ethics, right? From truly globally elite institutions, right? We are forced to think in ways that, and trained methodologically to think in ways that very smart scholars in Eastern Europe simply don't have the opportunity to have that kind of training, okay? We have the melting pot of the engagement, the ecumenical engagement, that you are not going to have in Serbia, Georgia, Russia, right? It just doesn't exist, right? All you get is the kind of demonized caricatures. You don't get the actual meals together, right? And because the majority of us are not ordained, but are tenured, we have a level of academic independence that fundamentally does not exist anywhere else in the world. And that is a recipe for pushing boundaries that no theologian in Greece or Romania or Ukraine or any of the other traditional places, they just don't have it. It's not to say they don't want it, and it's not to say that they couldn't do it better than us if they had those three things. It's just to say that we have this particular recipe here that I think is doing that. And the work of the Fordham Center and all of the kind of work that it is now that it is encouraging elsewhere, I think is a really great example of this. So the first time that a bunch of people my generation, I'm 53, right? So about 15 years ago, we were at a conference in Volos, Greece, which is, it's not a university, right? It's kind of a bishop's academy, but it is run by a spectacular scholar by the name of Pandeli Kalitsidis, and it's probably the only progressive place progressive in Greece is not necessarily progressive in the United States, right? It's the only progressive theological space in Greece. And there was a conference there about 15 years ago, and a whole bunch of us of my generation, John Baer was there, would be a name you would know. Paul Gravolyuk was there, another name you might know, Peter Butenev, myself, Telly, John Fotopoulos, Perry Hamal. Anyway, there's a bunch of us. And Metropolitan John Zazoulis was there. And he had never heard any of us present, right? And he heard the whole conference. I mean, it was very, very flattering. And he was not talking about me, he was talking about the others. But he said, I learned, because he gave the concluding remarks. He said, I had no idea that the sun rises in the west. Right? That was his assessment of the kind of caliber and freedom that American Orthodox theologians are enabled to have and to push. And, you know, so our center at Fordham, because we push the Christian unity thing, and because we push the women in the church thing, in some conservative corners we're completely vilified, and that's fine, right? It is what it is. But I can't tell you the number of Orthodox bishops, Greek, OCA, Antiochian, Serbian, no Russian, but that's okay, right? Who kind of pull me aside. They won't say it publicly, but they will pull me aside and say, keep doing absolutely everything you're doing because we can't do it. All right? So, yeah. Second questions?
So that's a different question. You said earlier there is a non-theological ecumenism on the right. And you think that's...
And probably on the left, too.
That is my question.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this and I thought, well, you could make an argument that in the precursor institutions to the World Council of Churches, there was an idea, and it comes back in Hans Küng's notion of world ethos, that despite our dogmatic disagreements, we can come together, and we actually need to come together to work for the betterment of the world on ethical issues, leaving those aside. And you could say, on the right, they could have the same kind of approach. They work together, and maybe not your ethics or my ethics, but for them, they agree on ethical issues. They might disagree on dogmatic issues. Right. So one could give that a positive spin. You gave it a negative spin. Yeah. But then I was thinking about, I'm from Germany, so I was thinking about European politics. And there is an analogy that came to my mind. On the left, politically, there's always kind of internationalizing, working together. Yeah. And now, on the right in Europe, there is a similar movement, but it seems very fragile because there's a lot of nationalist parties that have very nationalist goals, and so they join on the one hand together
to resist refugees or whatever. Yeah.
They very quickly fall apart because, of course, each of them has very nationalistic, with regard to their own country, goals, and that kind of ecumenism, political ecumenism, only goes that far if you're only interested in Polish or Hungarian or Spanish or Italian or German.
But maybe in multi-religious nations, don't those kind of end up working together? Like in Germany, right? You have Protestants and Catholics in Germany. Do you find on the right that they work together?
I was making the analogy just to political things. I'm not sure. The churches in Germany, the large churches, are kind of all somewhat on the left from Catholic and Protestant. Yeah. So the kind of evangelicalism that you have here is so small that it's hard to say if that would be the case.
Yeah. Anyway, I distracted you. Go
on. So my question is, how would you? One could see it as a theological, or as a to say, yes, we invest in ethical things, or you could. I'm struggling how to evaluate that. I'm not particularly sympathetic to it, but how you evaluate that kind of ecumenism.
Yeah. So I'll have to. So look. So my real expertise is the ancient medieval world, of which this has nothing to do. So I'm a bit of an interloper, like when I get into the nitty-gritty, right? So I'm just kind of making a series of observations. I do think that Okay, my threshold would be, what's the ultimate motivation? Is the ultimate motivation Christian unity, or at least Christian moral common cause? Or is the ultimate goal some kind of political or ethical goal that you can achieve with religious instrumentalization? And that's why I say it can just as easily occur on the left as well, right? Yeah, I guess that would be my, now, that's not to say that I'm going to get into somebody's heart and know what they're really doing. It's simply to say that from my vantage point, I see that kind of thing going on, where it just seems to be so clear, at least to me, that religion is being instrumentalized for another goal, rather than Christian unity being the goal. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a really enlightening conversation.
Okay. Cool.
Thank you all for joining us, and thank you at home for joining us. I will say that one of the things that attracted me most fully to the Aquinas Center was its Catholic-Orthodox initiative, this kind of ecumenism that's grassroots, that is so important and central. And so we're going to continue having these kind of events,
Great.
And I hope that you continue to join us. And thank you so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great.